The 2014 border between Ukraine and Russia. It was a topic recently on the mind of Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. Indeed, his trip to NATO headquarters last month sent many shockwaves through Western political circles. The conversation that followed tended to focus on the United States shifting its security priorities away from Europe and toward the Indo-Pacific region. Confession time, I am guilty here too. And there is 46 minutes of video and a cameo from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte to prove it. However, today, I want to focus on a different part of his comments. That the United States wants, like Europe, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Is he right? Well, answering that question is the primary task for the rest of this video. But to preview, there are 3 ways it could happen, each with a different timeline. Just do not go running to the casino to place any bets on them. We should start with a couple of subtleties about what Hegseth said and did not say. The year that he chose is interesting. 2014 corresponds to the Revolution of Dignity, and the beginning of the military hostilities between Ukraine and Russia. Pre-2014 borders would therefore be a turning back of the clock, before the Russian annexation of Crimea, or the shadow wars in Luhansk and Donetsk. That corresponds to the de jure line that you normally see on Western maps. Note that Hegseth did not say 2022 borders, which would carve out the Crimean Peninsula and a couple of parts of eastern Ukraine. This is an important distinction, because 2014 is a much loftier goal than a simple return to the pre-full-scale invasion boundaries. In that regard, Hegseth was not actually ruling out all that much. Even an assessment where Ukraine captures all of Luhansk and Donetsk would still be consistent with his declaration, so long as Crimea remains unrealistic. The nuance there was easy to miss. If you look at the headlines on the topic, some were careful to flag the 2014 date, while others ambiguously just discussed pre-war borders, leaving unclear whether they meant the start of the Shadow War or Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. By my count, about 27% of the border-focused headlines went the ambiguous route. Yet others ignored that aspect of the story entirely, instead choosing to focus on Hegseth's comments regarding Ukraine's NATO membership. That is the danger of sourcing your news from only one location. And while you, as someone knee-deep in lines on maps, likely familiarize yourself with the whole of this story, think about all the other news topics where you only really consume the headlines. Fortunately, today's sponsor, Ground News, has a solution. It compactly aggregates news headlines, allowing all of us to quickly understand the ratio of which headlines say what. And for the headlines that you might not see, its well-known blind spot feature takes care of the rest. You can get all of these features and more at a steep 40% discount by visiting ground.news/linesonmaps or by scanning the QR code on your screen to take you directly there. And thanks again to Ground News for making today's video possible. Speaking of possible, the second point is the exact word that Hegseth said was realistic. He did not use the word possible. Possible is a question of whether one could write down feasible ways that could take a line of control from currently here and move it to back here. In fact, we can do that readily with mechanisms like the various different ways that Putin falls from power and the internal struggle that might result, or the decay of Russian defenses, or a long-run insurgency in the Russian-controlled areas. And indeed, we will spend most of our time working through each of those cases today. However, Realistic pairs those possibilities with an intelligence assessment that they have a reasonable shot of occurring. So, to preview the rest of this video, could these things happen? Sure. Are they likely to return Ukraine to the 2014 borders? Not so much. Might these generate an outcome closer to the 2022 borders than the status quo? Yes, plausibly. To be clear, none of what I just said is particularly controversial within the open source intelligence community. I am presenting the consensus belief here. Now, we know less about the situation than the government intelligence organizations do. Still, it is telling that, despite a political firestorm over Hegseth's comments, we have not heard any leaked intelligence reports that run contrary to that assessment. To state that differently, there is a perception that the Trump administration's public position on likely war outcomes is clouded by the president's lack of interest in European affairs more generally. And it is possible that, simultaneously, the administration is suppressing intelligence reports that suggest Ukraine is in a much better position than the whole Oval Office "you don't have the cards" meltdown would suggest. However, if both of those things were true, then we would be hearing about the intelligence assessments. Indeed, within the United States, those assessments would have been completed under the Biden administration, which was not subject to the same accusations of clouded judgment. Moreover, I need not tell you that there are plenty of disgruntled federal employees right now, thanks in large part to what is happening with DOJ, and democracies tend to be leaky in this type of situation. Never mind that there are a bunch of other countries actively opposed to the US pivot, who have their own independent intelligence assessments, and who are not objecting to claims regarding the military situation. We are also starting to see the effects of this in Ukrainian public opinion polls, where now half of the respondents want a quick end to the war. Assessments can be wrong, of course. Just go back to the beginning of the war, the Kremlin's expectation that Kyiv could be Russian within 3 or 4 days, and the US belief that seemed to match that. However, we are now past 3 years of war, and the underlying mystery of what could happen is diminished. We are in a situation where it is less likely that someone knows something of major importance that the other side does not know. To formalize what I mean by that, think about the chances of, say, Grand Theft Auto being released in 2025. Whether it does or does not depends on the current state of development, which is something that we do not observe. You could imagine 2 people with different perspectives on what will happen. This is Darius. He thinks that there are equal chances that the game's current development state is advanced, on target, or behind. If it is advanced, then there is a 75% chance that it will come out this year. If it is on target, then there is a 50% chance that it will come out this year. And if it is behind, then there is a 25% chance that it will come out this year. Averaging out all of the probabilities, Darius has a 50% total expectation of a 2025 release. Now think of this from Megan's perspective. She is an insider, and knows for a fact that GTA 6's development state is on target. And as such, she believes that there is a 50% chance of it reaching the stores by calendar's end. Interestingly, Darius and Megan have common final expectations. However, there is a difference in variance based on what they might learn. In fact, Megan has nothing to learn at the moment. She is locked in at 50-50. Meanwhile, if Darius were to be granted access to the Rockstar Games studio, he could find out the state of the game, and it would solidify his expectation. With the benefit of omniscience, we know he will find out that it is still 50%. But he also accepts that he could wake up tomorrow and think it is 75 or 25. Well, to close the analogy, the war's current state looks much more like Megan's beliefs than Darius's beliefs. That is to say, there is still variation in what could happen on the battlefield, and we do not have as clean of knowledge about the full fundamentals as Megan did. But what we will learn from the next few months of fighting is unlikely to cause a massive change in our beliefs about what might happen over the following few months. Still, what we will discuss next touches on some of the question marks that remain. Let's review those possibilities, beginning with chaos and the Kremlin. The core mechanism here is that Russia gets so preoccupied with its domestic political situation that continuing the war becomes infeasible. The most obvious way that could happen is via a coup, or a coup-like substance, such as a throwback to Yevgeny Prigozhin. Ukraine would hope for something to the effect of the Russian Revolution, where the struggle at home forces a troop withdrawal from the near abroad. That would allow Ukraine to quickly reclaim the territory, and then set up defenses to inhibit any Russian attempts to try again once things have settled back down in Moscow. Leave it up to the West to help build the trenches and figure out how much of a peacekeeping force to send. You would also hear a discussion about it being a limited time opportunity to admit Ukraine into NATO, as the territorial dispute would appear to vanish in the short term. It would be a poetic bookending of the whole saga, as Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was predicated on Kyiv being in the middle of a revolution. Something similar could happen if Putin dies and a succession crisis envelops the capital. To be clear, I do mean chaos in the Kremlin here. A simple, run-of-the-mill regime change would not be enough. If a mystery successor either gains power via a clean coup or orderly post-funeral transition, he is unlikely to simply withdraw to the 2014 borders. In short, the annexation of Crimea was incredibly popular within Russia. Anyone who wants broad public support as a new leader could not leave there without causing more domestic turbulence. Rather, Ukraine would have to rely on commanders being too busy picking sides as marches take place on the streets of Moscow to care about what is happening in Kupiansk. Other territories may be more pliable, depending on the economic threats that the West can leverage, which is not looking as good right now. The Trump administration wants the war to end one way or another, and so it is difficult to imagine that the United States plays hardball, even with a golden but one-shot opportunity. Ukraine trying to reach the January 2022 borders would not be a simple political problem for the new Russian leader either. Following this annexation ceremony, the 4 occupied oblasts are on the same legal footing as Crimea, Moscow, or any other oblast according to Federation law. As for the likelihood of such an occurrence, things are working against Ukraine at the moment. We discussed Russia's recruitment strategy not too long ago, but to keep it short and focus on what is new, Russia is indeed meeting its recruitment goals. All it is having to offer are competitive market rate contracts. In turn, the odds of a march on the streets of Moscow were low already, because the finances of the war look outright attractive to many average Alexanders and Alexeys. But now they are lower with this playing on loop on Russian television. The bigger threat was coming from the financially frustrated oligarch class, who were implicitly footing the bill for the war in the form of foregone business opportunities and a terrible investment climate. But even for them, the meltdown lowers the likelihood of a challenge. Oligarchs would still need to anticipate the public going along for the coup ride, lest mass public strikes make capturing the presidency more trouble than it is worth. So if the public thinks that Russia is in a fantastic geopolitical position, anyone launching a coup would be outright disrupting that, and also negating some of the economic gains that they have made over the last 3 years. Good luck winning that argument. The second possibility puts Ukraine on the offense, taking back territory by force due to a deteriorated defensive line. You may be familiar with the basics of the general strategy from Ukraine's 2023 offensive. First, cut the Crimean land bridge in half, then lay siege to the Crimean Peninsula, disable the Crimean bridge to the best of Ukraine's abilities, eventually push back north, and then conclude by setting sights on the Donbass. Well, that general outline is still sensible given the right military might to execute it. However, you will recall that the major problem that Ukraine encountered was the Surovikin line, the defensive entrenchments that allowed Russia to hold back the offensive. More than a year and a half has passed now, with Russia on the initiative and taking territory along the Eastern Front. It is possible that those entrenchments have fallen into a state of disrepair due to neglect. If so, then it is also possible that Ukraine's second attempt may go better. However, there are some heroic assumptions built into that conjecture, which makes it quite the stretch. First, Ukraine actually has to stop the Russian offensive. Second, it would need to start reversing the trends. And third, Russia would have to misidentify the battlefield situation and not repair the line before Ukraine approaches it. Look, we know that Russia is suffering a ton of casualties on the current offensive, and Ukraine's hope is that Russia's advance will stop itself. And that may yet come to fruition. But even holding firm at Pokrovsk is still a long way away from getting Ukraine back on the offensive, and that will be all the more difficult if Kyiv cannot rely on the Trump administration for military aid. Meanwhile, if Russia does eventually stop, it will try entrenching the new front line. Thus, there are so many question marks here that it is the biggest long shot of the three possibilities. That takes us to the final option, insurgency. This one has the longest time horizon, but it is a necessary topic to understand the uphill battle that the Kremlin will eventually face. Let's rewind to the start of the invasion. Actually, the invasion was supposed to be the easy part. Ukraine was militarily outmatched, and the government was liable to fall in less than a week, as all sorts of materiel flowed over the border. In fact, the military training that Washington was offering to Ukraine on the eve of the attack was how to conduct a proper insurgency campaign. If Ukraine was going to emerge as a still independent country, it would only be after a long bloodletting of the Russian occupation forces. Actually, this got Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner hung up on the entire situation. He is the one on the right. Feiner could not square the circle of why Russia would want to invade at all if the Kremlin was going to have to run an extended counterinsurgency afterward. And it was a broader problem in convincing European allies that an invasion was about to happen. Well, a conventional war still rages 3 years later, while an insurgency quietly happens behind the scenes in the occupied Oblasts. The media's silence partly due to operational security, and partly due to the lack of media on that side of the Dnipro. However, partisan attacks in Kherson were critical to the counteroffensive campaign back in the fall of 2022. For example, a 3-person team consisted of a taxi driver and a bartender who would collect intelligence and then pass it along to a third member, who would then call in strikes. That helped the Ukrainian army break through in November of that year. And if you were wondering, like me, what the heck a watermelon was doing in this picture, rejoice because I have the answer. Kherson produces about half of Ukraine's watermelons, so it is a symbol for the region. When asked why he was visiting the city following Ukrainian forces retaking it, Zelensky remarked that it was because he wanted some of the fruit. Anyway, the long-run hope for Ukraine would be to mount casualties in a manner that would eventually make the continued occupation politically infeasible for the Kremlin. Basically the same plan as the war itself, but on a slower timescale. It is also why Ukraine is unlikely to formally part with any of the territories as a part of a ceasefire agreement. Rather, it will just be an acknowledgement of a vague line of control. However, that will get harder the further that you move into territories with greater Russian sympathies, like the heart of the Donbass or Crimea. And that takes us back to Hegseth's point, that a reversion to the 2014 borders via war is not realistic. Actually, the insurgency strategy presupposes that the war ends anyway. But one should not confuse any of this as an argument that the line only shifts one direction. Ukraine can still move it eastward, but it will need the support of the West to get there. Thanks again to Ground News for sponsoring today's video. You can use this QR code to get a great discount on their Vantage plan, and you can follow their Ukraine topic to stay informed about what is going on in the world. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.